ECCD tried to reach out to MPs to share the facts on the ground with them. And one of the reactions we have received was really stunning. The reaction was, why are you talking to us and criticizing us? What have the Americans done? What have the British done? And what choices do we have? And it's a question that we have to ask. Do they have any other choices? And to help us understand that, I'm going to ask Dr. Wael Haddara to talk about the choices that Western governments, and in particular the government of Canada, has. Wael Haddara.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here, although pleasure is being used rather loosely given the context, but certainly a privilege. It's going to be very hard for me to follow Dr. Abu-Zahra's diction and delivery, but so please try to block that last presentation from your minds. I want to organize my comments around 3 points. The first is just a very, very brief set of remarks about our year in office. And I use that term very deliberately. It was a year in office, not in power. There's a difference between the two. I want to talk about the experiences that we've had since the coup with other governments, and then I'm going to close with a brief perspective on what we should be trying to do here in Canada. My involvement with the administration of Mohammed Morsi is a matter of the public record. There's a piece in the London Free Press that was published if you want to refer to how I got involved with this. Very briefly, it was actually through Khaled Qazzaz, who was a good friend of mine during his time here in Canada and roped me into this, for which I am very grateful. I think it was an incredibly important exercise. As Sarah talks about Khaled, the idea that we could actually try to rebuild a country was an incredibly motivating idea. And I would not say that we have failed. I would not yet say that we have failed. Much was done, and I think the history is still being written. When I assess our performance in the past, in the year of the presidency of Mohammed Morsi, I always say that we made many mistakes. People usually ask me, do you not think that there were many mistakes made? And I say yes. And for every mistake that you can tell me, I can give you 3. Mine are usually better because I was there. So without a doubt, we made many mistakes. But the issue really was, were these mistakes anything out of the ordinary in terms of a society in transition, a society that is emerging from 60 years of repression towards an uncertain democracy? And what is the remedy for those mistakes? And whatever you may think of our performance, I think it is very clear that what we are going through at the moment is infinitely worse. Egypt is not more stable or more secure or in a happier place than it was under the presidency of Mohammed Morsi. There were elections, parliamentary elections, that were coming up and were being held up only by the very man who is now president of Egypt, the head of the Supreme Constitutional Court. And if those elections were allowed to go forward and Mohammed Morsi or his Freedom and Justice Party were truly as deeply unpopular as people say, then we would have seen that get reflected in the parliamentary elections, hence also in who gets to form government. And we would have had a prime minister that would have been able to more correctly represent the will of the people, if that was really the case. I will say only one other thing about the issue of our year in office because it was raised, and that is the role of women. We are very proud, and Khaled was a main driver of this, to have introduced women to the presidency of the Arab Republic of Egypt. In the last 60 years, there has never been a woman serving in the presidential palace in any capacity whatsoever, let alone in the senior capacities in which Mohammed Morsi appointed women. We have an assistant to the president, that's the rank of deputy prime minister. That is the first ever in the history of Egypt. Our coordinator for a nascent think tank that Khaled helped establish, called the Egyptian Foreign Policy Forum, was a woman. Our human rights coordinator in the presidency was a woman. These are all master's or PhD level scholars, people with extensive experience in their field of work. And in fact, our senior foreign media coordinator was also a woman. People, it really and truly took the other staff who were essentially left over from the military. Almost all of the presidency staff was military. It took them a long time to adjust to the idea that there are actually women who are working in the presidential office. I do not say this to imply that there were no issues or that women's rights in Egypt are at a satisfactory place. They're not. But like many other things, the challenge that we face with respect to equality, with respect to tolerance, with respect to respect for women and their role and what they can bring, is a deeply complicated problem that has arisen over many, many years and will not be resolved over time, and most importantly, will not be resolved by decree. It requires a societal dialogue, it requires conversations, it requires leadership, for sure, by a responsive and responsible presidency and legislature, but fundamentally it requires stability. And that's one of the things that we have had less and less and less of over the last year. The president used to say that we are going through a bottleneck, and our challenge is to pass through that bottleneck without the bottle breaking. What the army has done effectively over the last 10 months is do just that. Since the coup, I have traveled to a number of countries, predominantly Europe, Washington, D.C. as well. And as I was mentioning to one of our colleagues before the event, I have yet to meet anyone in foreign relations in any country, whether it is Malaysia, whether it is the various European countries, or DC. I've yet to meet anyone who believes that this regime is stable or sustainable. And in fact, many countries are calibrating what they feel is a difficult situation accordingly. The United Kingdom, despite the position that they have taken on the Muslim Brotherhood and the pressure that they've come under, have withheld export licenses for weapons that can be used to suppress Egyptians. Other countries, Germany, for example, has also prevented a shipment of weapons going to Egypt. The pronouncements, at least the official pronouncements of the European Union, if you look at the Council of Europe, have been extremely negative. They have referred to unprecedented repression when describing the actions of the Egyptian regime. And so various governments have been very critical. Whereas there isn't as much action to go with those words, that leads me really to my last point of the issue of other governments. I think it's instructive to behold that exercise. Psychologists, social psychologists, talk about something called othering. Othering is the process of describing and holding the other as other. That is, we are all different, but you're all the same. We judge ourselves by our best intentions, but we judge you by your actions, because you're fundamentally different. And that's been one of my experiences over our year in office. When Europe or the United States addressed the presidency of Mohammed Morsi, we were expected to do wonders. We were expected to transform the human rights situation within, overnight. We were expected to introduce and maintain gender equality at the touch of a button, really, with a wave of a magic wand of some sort. We were supposed to bring about stability in terms of street demonstrations, improve police methods, which are brutal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we were expected to do that because we were the government. And yet, when you turn around now and you speak to those self-same governments about their perspective on what is happening, there's no dispute about the terrible unprecedented, to use the words of the Council of Europe, unprecedented repression that is going on in Egypt right now. And yet they're quite comfortable saying, but we're in a difficult spot because the situation is complicated. That's othering. Othering is to say, I can excuse my actions because the situation is very difficult and we have such little influence and we can do so very little, and it is important to remain engaged. Now those are all phrases that people use, but we agree with you, it's a terrible situation. But when it comes to your own practice, you should have done this and this and this and this and this with considerably fewer resources and considerably less power and influence even within the local situation. To close, what should we do in Canada? I would argue that in Canada we are fortunate enough to have probably the least interest in terms of geopolitical interest in the Middle East or in Canada or in Egypt of all the major allies. And that affords us the privilege of actually standing on principle. The world will survive in the broadest sense only if we are able to come to conflicts. A world without rules, a world in which conflicts are resolved through force or through power, is a world that will end very badly. We see this in Ukraine, we have seen this throughout the last century, and I don't think any of us here need to be instructed about this point. And so what we need to stand for, and what we need to stand in support of, is the rule of law. Governments do not change hands through military coups. Governments do not get removed at the whims of generals. Democracy can never be brought in on the backs of tanks or the points of bayonets and guns. It's a very important point to make. It's a very important point for a middle power like Canada to stand by, to propagate, to push hard for, because fundamentally, even if we look simply at self-interest, if we are ever in a position where we are in conflict with a larger country, be that our neighbors to the south, be that China, be that the Arctic, we will want to be able to resort to the rule of law. And when we refuse, when we ignore the imperative of doing so, standing in principle for the rule of law for others, then others also refuse or see themselves able to not do the same for us when we have that need. The rule of law is the key to world stability, and Canada has a long and proud tradition of pushing for that and supporting that, and that is a tradition we should not undermine or abandon at this point. Thank you.